targets.
We have helicopter practice, which is going on right next to us now, and then people may be able to hear that. But this helicopter really then can just sort of hover behind these berms that we've been hearing about, peer over them and take a look at the troops and give advance warning to the ground troops, right?
Yes, sir, Bruce, it sure can. And it allows you to go ahead and look at the enemy at nighttime without being detected. And that's the most important thing for our survivability at nighttime, is to be so we cannot be detected during the night and day.
Well, for some people who see this, it almost looks like a traffic helicopter, but it certainly is not. It is a helicopter with a lot of high-tech equipment. Tell us about what some of this is used for.
A lot of this equipment in here is basically for processors back here, just like you would have on your home computer. And all the processors are back in here and allows the pilot to access through a screen up front in the cockpit. It's all computer generated and allows us to use our inertia nav system in there, and also lets us look through pictures as far as the MMS is concerned, and also...
it's a very high-tech operation.
Yes, sir, it sure is, Bruce.
Okay, what we have here then from this particular helicopter, which by the way carries no armament, so no weapons, they just act as the eyes of the advancing army. Dan?
Bruce Hall, thanks. Our CBS News coverage of the ground war offensive underway in the Gulf will continue after these messages.
He's absolutely correct. The biggest danger to U.S. and Allied forces was the enormous number of, they called them tubes, artillery tubes. The Iraqis started out this war with 3,100 pieces of artillery, and over the last 6 weeks, the United States has destroyed almost half of that artillery. But it's still a serious problem, and the plan to deal with that over the last several weeks has been developed, and let me just show you here on the map. The plan to deal with that was not to go in at every angle and come at them from all sides, but to drive straight through and drive 1/4 up, all right, and freeze off the rest of the Iraqi troops, literally surround them and freeze them off, and to avoid the sort of trench warfare and avoid the long-range artillery that the Iraqis have. And in that manner, they would minimize casualties. They would get through the minefields in one area and charge up 30, 40, 50 miles in just one area and forget the rest of the minefields and the rest of the artillery, both up in here and the rest of the minefields down in here. The Iraqi Third Army, which roughly covers an area like this, the Iraqi Third Army, has been pounded heavily the last several weeks and was not considered to be an effective fighting force, and there were no plans to fight that Third Army here. There was only a plan to drive up the coast road from Khafji, that Saudi city we heard of, the Battle of Khafji, to drive up the coast road to Kuwait City and literally ignore the whole Third Army in here. And that way you ignore the minefields and you stay away from the Iraqi artillery. And as I understand it from Pentagon officials and other officials, that's the way the plan kicked off, and they hope it's going to be successful, and initially we're told it's been very successful. Garrett?
Fred, what you're saying here is that Saddam Hussein's and the Iraqi High Command's battle plan really has been the wrong one from the very beginning, because they've been emphasizing the importance of their defensive positions, trench warfare. They wanted to get the American Allied forces to come to them and then fight that battle and bloody the American units. Couldn't they have anticipated that we'd come up with some way of getting around that?
Well, they had no other choice. I mean, even though they had 42 divisions, 545,000 men, what they essentially did in the defense was do a modern-day Maginot Line, where they ran a defense with trenches all the way out here. They even ran it into Iraq. Then it came back up here, and they tried to seal Kuwait off. Well, the American plan from the beginning was to just circle around on top of this and then find various holes and punch through. All the Iraqi troops that were down in here, their supplies have been cut off for some weeks. These are the troops that have been living on 4 and 5 tablespoons of rice and a cup of water a day. And these are the troops we heard earlier to say from coalition forces. We heard earlier this evening, these troops in here have been giving up by the thousands. And also the first troops that were hit on Faleka Island, they gave up rather quickly. And these troops have been isolated and have had no supplies. So the only defense that Iraq could have put up was this defense. And the other defense Iraq had, as we were killing Iraqi tanks, all in here were the Republican Guard divisions, 150,000 men and over 1,000 pieces of armor. They had to bury their equipment, literally bury their equipment to hide them from Allied planes. Well, the plan was to drive up around into Iraq and come down on top of the Republican Guards before they could dig out. And we are told that that was the plan. For many weeks they've been practicing it, and we expect that they have executed it in just that fashion. Garrick?
Well, Fred, what you're really saying there is no way out for the Iraqi forces if and when they are surrounded there, that their choice is either to fight or to surrender, correct?
Absolutely. And in fact, even in diplomacy, if you could call it that, even in diplomacy, there was no way out, because as you'll recall, the president gave them 7 days to withdraw with all their equipment. Well, that brought smiles to the faces of many Pentagon officials, because a military man knows there is no way to withdraw thousands of tanks and pieces of artillery and armored personnel carriers in 7 days and bring it all back into Iraq. An impossible task. So that was built into the diplomacy, and it is now built into the war plan. The war plan is to encircle all of Kuwait and not let them withdraw, and they have to surrender.
All right. Fred Francis, we'll see if it works out that way and how soon it works out that way. It's interesting that the war that is being fought there has been fought in many ways according to the manual of World War II or the Korean War, those massed units for many years. In fact, for a couple of decades, the emphasis in military circles had shifted to unconventional warfare. Vietnam was an example of that. But here we are again in 1991 at the end of this century, going back to the massed formations, the traditional textbook, the military manual of how to fight large-scale wars. We'll see how that textbook stands up in the days.
The situation will be changed by all of this. For a long, long time, this country has been preparing to fight the big war against the Soviet Union, the Cold War that has been going on, and everyone fearing that it would go into a hot war of some kind. Now, obviously, there's a need for a more flexible response to the brush fire situation that could develop, and as well, in this case, we have an exceptional alliance fighting side by side, the French, the British, the United States, the Saudi Arabians, and we've not yet heard whether the Egyptians and the Syrian ground troops who have been positioned here are involved in this invasion of Kuwait. It's something that we'll be eager to hear about, because that could have, obviously, a big effect on the political outcome of the war itself. And by the way, we heard earlier when you were saying that Saddam Hussein told Evgeny Primakov as late as last fall that the Palestinian homeland question was not terribly important to him. It's just one more demonstration of the kind of man that you're dealing with. He sold out his people after an 8-year war against Iran. He made a peace with Iran as soon as he had trouble here in the Persian Gulf as a result of his invasion of Kuwait. And he was attempted publicly, at least, to string along the Palestinians to say that he was doing this in their behalf and arouse the PLO on the West Bank and in Jordan. Now it turns out that in October it wasn't important to him, and in the past week or so he dropped that as an issue of linkage. Let's go now to the home front in the United States. NBC's Jim Cummins is, as he has been on several occasions in the past week or so, in Killeen, Texas. He's at Fort Hood, which is the home of one of the big armored units, and he's talking to some reservists there. Jim?
That's right, Tom. Fort Hood is the home of the 1st Cavalry Division and the 2nd Armored Division, as you mentioned. More than 20,000 troops from Fort Hood are now in the war zone, many of them on the front lines. Tonight, after the first word of a full-scale ground war, we stopped by a Sears store near the Army base to see what people had to say about this latest development in the war and what it means to their friends and relatives.
Well, I'm just praying for them and waiting to see if my unit's going to be called.
50 years old. They're World War II vintage ships. We have some file pictures that were taken earlier in the war of them firing both in the daytime and at night. These ships can have just incredible firepower, Dan. They fire 16-inch shells. Each of those shells weighs 1,900 pounds, which is about the weight of a small car. And one of the advantages of a battleship, of course, and here's firing at night, I believe this is by the Missouri in an earlier action in the war, is that a battleship, unlike an airplane, can stay on station 24 hours. It doesn't have to come back to refuel. It doesn't have to worry about weather conditions. And I think, combined with McEwen's report that there are battleships firing And now this new report that the Navy and the Marines appear to have fought for Failaka. This would indicate to me that the likelihood of an amphibious operation in Kuwait itself, I think, probably gains a lot more credibility. If they're firing the battleship guns out there, it looks to me like the Marines are getting ready to move.
Well, Eric, with the firing of those big guns of the Missouri and the Wisconsin, I'm thinking about Captain Bill, who commands the Wisconsin. Here was a bona fide, certified hero of the Vietnam War. He fought some hellacious battles in the River War, far up the Mekong River, had at least one boat, and it was a river boat blown out from underneath him. He explained how General Walter Boomer and the Marines planned to put a pincer movement, if General Schwarzkopf ordered it, a pincer movement on Kuwait City with one Marine force driving, smashing up the land just on the coast, and the amphibious forces coming in from the other way. Now, as you say, the capturing of this island gives it a little more credibility. We'll have to wait and see, maybe a long time before we find out whether it turns out to be a feint, a kind of diversionary, of course. Let's go to Hattie Kaufman of CBS this morning. She's with families at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Hattie?
Dan, it would be difficult to find anyone in the Fort Bragg, Fayetteville area who is not directly connected with this war effort. Now, throughout the day, the family members of servicemen here have been filled with anxiety, some of them glued to the television, watching every news development, while other ones seem to try to ignore the passing of the deadline at noon. But tonight, there was no ignoring it.
Saudi Arabian desert from fog and suspension system.
Outside Fort Bragg, word spread slowly through the crowd. The ground war had started.
Hussein's been trying to play both ends against the middle all along. He tried to play the Israelis, and then he turned to the Russians.
Not have relatives on the front line.
My son's in the 82nd. He's right on the Kuwaiti borders. I'm sure if it's begun, he's right in the midst of it.
And I think the perfect thing for Israel to do to get into the war is put the A-bomb on Baghdad, and we'll end it.
Strong words from a community that has shown very strong support for Desert Storm. You have to realize 30,000 troops were deployed right here from the Fort Bragg area, and true, the war began in January, but that was really the war of the Air Force, and for so many of the family members around here, their war began tonight with the ground troops. Dan?
Hattie, we've spent some time in the last few weeks and over the last few months with the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne, and we can report to you that their morale was extremely high as they waited on the cusp of the ground war that has now begun. Our CBS News coverage of the ground offensive will continue.
Certainly not from the Baghdad area, I can say that freely here. And obviously we haven't been down towards the front. We haven't been able to go to the main roads and supply routes and things. We haven't been able to see any of that, so I can't comment on that. But from around here, you wouldn't know that anything was going on.
Okay, in a related vein, what about political activity, political maneuvering, now that it looks like the last days of Saddam Hussein's government may be the days ahead?
Well, that's going to be the interesting thing to wait and see how this shakes down, how he survives. As I say, he's been keeping a very low profile. The last thing we heard was a speech a couple of nights ago where he was quite defiant, although saying he wanted peace, quite defiant, saying that if there was a ground war, Iraq was ready to go for it and ready to, as they put it, repel the enemy forces. Yesterday, all we know is that he chaired a meeting of the Command Council for the latest developments. And as you know, he gave Tariq Aziz, the foreign minister, the permission to negotiate and to accept an unconditional withdrawal according to the Soviets. That's about as far as I guess he thought he could go. There's a saying here in the Arab world that it is better to go down in flames than in shame. And perhaps that's what the deal is right now.
It seems 8:25 or so in the morning. They're still pretty early. Have you been out in the streets and have you had an opportunity just to talk to ordinary Iraqis and perhaps share information that you have that they don't about this ground war?
We haven't had an opportunity, but that's the next thing on our agenda. As you know, we are under restrictions of movement. We can't move outside until we have escorts with us. And people are just about getting geared up for that kind of thing now. There are trips planned around today, some around the country outside of the city, and we're planning on going off on some of those, and we'll be able to talk to people But from our talks with people in the streets yesterday and over the last few days, although of course everybody expressed the hope that this wouldn't come to a ground war, many people were expecting that it would. They had also a lot of hope from the Soviet proposal. And when word was filtering in that it basically wasn't good enough for the Allies, a lot of people were basically sort of steeling themselves towards what would come. And the feeling on the streets from people and from officials that we are able to talk to, the feeling is that Iraq, while it doesn't want the war, does not want to be humiliated. There's still a fierce pride here, so despite the realities of what may or may not be their military positions, they take a very fierce pride, and they maintain that they're ready to fight and can do it.
Now, can you tell us if the supply of services may have been interrupted in any way? Is electricity and other forms of power even rarer than it was before? Is water even rarer than it was before? Any change in living conditions over these last few hours?
Not at all, not at all. I can speak only for the Baghdad area. As you know, there have been power outages for the last several weeks. I mean, basically there's no electricity in the city except for what is generated by private generators. Water is very intermittent. The water flow, a couple of hours a day there is water, but nothing has changed over the last few hours.
Any further indication of whether your own conditions are going to be changing? It sounds like you're operating pretty well the way you did yesterday, under close Iraqi control, but except for that, pretty much business as usual for you and the rest of the Western Press Corps.
If I heard you correctly, do I think there'll be any change in our position? I can't tell. We carry on under the restrictions that we've been carrying on under for the last several weeks. As I say, when we asked to make this phone call, there was immediate permission to do so. It's really a question of wait and see.
Okay, Christiane Amanpour, thanks very much for that live report from Baghdad, and take good care. Susan?
And as CNN's this is News Center 4. We're switching now to NBC coverage.
With this standing up to Saddam Hussein, he does take risks when he knows he really has to do that or should do that. I think we're going to have to revise some opinions about George Bush and where he stands. Tom?
Well, as you say, we are within just 2 years of his presidency. We've had two major military operations, one in Panama, and now this very substantial land war, as well as air war here in the Persian Gulf. And you'll recall that he was the vice president to Ronald Reagan when there was the invasion of Grenada, and a strong supporter of military action on the ground in Central America in the Contra War as well. So George Bush, who had an early experience in military affairs, is not afraid to use American power. It's one of the lessons that apparently he feels very deeply from Vietnam. We will have continuing coverage of America now involved,
particularly into Iraq, and be on top of the Republican Guards divisions before they could dig out. And they even buried an American tank in the desert, Tom, and they found out that it took 4 hours to dig one of those tanks out, 4 men digging for 4 hours, and then the tank would not run because of the talc-like sand. So that was the high confidence we were hearing around the Pentagon. And I also want to mention, Tom, we got some late pool reports in here, the Pentagon, the last pool reports that were filed just before this went out. One Apache pilot, that's the Apache tank-killing gunship, said, "It is not a formidable force," he said of the enemy just across the border. "It is not the force we were expecting." And that was one of the Apache crews where when the Apache shows up at the bunker, they fire a couple missiles and they use the loudspeaker to call them out, and there were surrenders. And then another soldier just before going off to battle said, quote, "We're not going to sleep until Brooklyn." And he shouted, and he used the V signal, and that was one pool report. And finally, I will tell you, Tom, and this I'm sure was all across the front, in one pool report, the last one to come out before the battle, it said, this was from a 26-year-old Army specialist from Alabama, quote, "I wasn't religious before I got here, but I've caught myself talking to God frequently." That's an end quote. The final pool reports before battle, Tom.
Thank you very much. NBC's Fred Francis, you'll recall, as part of his bombast before this war began, Saddam Hussein was promising what he described as the mother of all battles. We can only hope at this hour, from his point of view, that it will turn out to be, for him, the orphan of all battles. NBC's Gary Cutley is standing by now in New York. Gary?
Tom, we're standing by with James Dunnigan, one of our military analysts, talking about the war, not just what's happening this evening in this ground offensive, but how what will happen in the coming days and weeks could change the way the American military conducts warfare. Each war brings new surprises, new developments, doesn't it?
Yes, and what makes this war unique, it's the first one we were actually ready for. We've been preparing for this war for 20 years, almost 20 years, since the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. We've developed whole generations of equipment. We've developed new methods to train the troops, which are proving to be very effective. We've invented devices that don't get much attention, like the Global Positioning System receivers, which makes it almost impossible to get lost in the desert, which has always been a major problem in operating in the desert.
Well, how do they work, for example?
Well, it's very simple. It's a little item about the size of a Walkman, and it literally gets signals from 2 or 3 satellites, and then on the display it tells you where you are. It's within 75 feet.
Even in the middle of the desert?
Anywhere in the world. On the air, on the ground, on a ship. It's just become available. It's been, cost us billions of dollars. And it's primarily for commercial uses for people on ships and in trucks or whatever.
Well, that's one example of how warfare does change.
And this is a dramatic change. Because throughout history, getting lost in the desert, the Romans did it, the Greeks did it, we've done it. The Israelis have done it, but now we've eliminated that problem.
Now, in the last several weeks in the Air War, we've learned about cruise missiles, about smart bombs, all kinds of new high-technology weapons. What happens on the ground? What should we keep our eyes on?
The same thing that's going to happen on the ground is what happened in the air. The Air Force was using high-technology weapons, which were high-technology weapons for 20 years. And in the 1970s and the 1960s, there were high-technology weapons that didn't work too well. But after 10 or 20 years, we have high-technology weapons that are reliable. You have the same thing in the desert. The M1 tank, for example. There's nothing radically different about the M1 tank, except all the goodies on it are things that were new 20 years ago, but now they work, and they work reliably.
Now, Saddam Hussein knows full well that we have the technological advantage when it came to the air war. Just look at Baghdad, his other military-industrial sites, and he's seen what has happened to them. And yet he has always thought and argued that on the ground, technology wasn't that big an advantage. It came down to the man-to-man confrontation.
Well, it's ironic. First of all, you have to remember that Saddam was trained as a lawyer, not a soldier. So he's going to turn arguments inside out to, satisfy whatever his whim of the moment is. He is, like many generals, fighting his last war. His last war was against hordes of Iranian infantry. If he scratched the surface of this one a little bit, he'd realize there's no teenage infantry out there. We're basically talking about, trained veteran soldiers in proven equipment. The Iranians had no high-tech. They had no M1 tanks. They had no GPS. They had no ability to maneuver.
When you look at the terrain, the fact that it is open desert for the most part, how big an advantage is that to our forces? Because in many wars we've read and learned that you want to use the terrain for camouflage. We don't have that here. Can we turn it to our advantage?
Indeed. In desert warfare, if you have the mobility advantage, which we have, if you have the air power advantage, which we have, you invariably win. And so this alone, gave the UN forces, the American forces, a lot of confidence, because no one who's ever had those advantages of mobility and air superiority has ever lost a desert war.
Well, let's talk about the psychological advantage, the psychological edge. American troops are very well trained, they're very well armed, they're half a world away from their homes. The Iraqi troops are here in Kuwait along their southern border between Iraq and Kuwait. Don't they have a psychological advantage in a certain way in terms of motivation?
Well, yes and no. They were first early described as battle-hardened veterans of the 8-year war. Well, they never fought in the desert. Most of them were not veterans of any fighting, to any degree. And a lot of them did not agree with the idea of one Arab country invading another. In fact, Saddam apparently shot more than 100 of his own officers who protested this. That's how they ensured discipline in Ba'ath Party-controlled Iraq. So a lot of them, and you'll see this from the Iraqi soldiers who have already surrendered, and you'll probably see it from those who will surrender, are not happy at all with that situation. So their morale may be better when they're fighting inside of Iraq. But as long as they're in Kuwait, a lot of them don't agree with that particular policy.
And we've been getting reports that along here on the southern border, large numbers of Iraqi soldiers have been surrendering to the Allies as they push into Kuwait. And the theory was raised several days ago. We knew that the morale was low among many of these Iraqi units, that perhaps many Iraqi commanders were waiting for the invasion so they could surrender, that they could do what they wanted to do, but they could not do it before the invasion for fear of what Saddam Hussein might do to them.
No, this is very true. The way the Ba'ath Party rules Iraq is through several different secret police organizations, not just one. They learned some of this from the Russians. There are informers everywhere, including inside the military units. The fellow commanding an infantry battalion might not know which 3 or 4 of his soldiers are informers for the Ba'ath Party. So they have to be very careful that they don't do something that will cause them to disappear in the middle of the night. And indeed, during the Iran-Iraq War, there were Iraqi units which surrendered when they were surrounded by Iranian troops and pretty certain that the Ba'ath Party wouldn't get to them and they could go up to the prison camps.
And they hope that although they will become prisoners, one day when they go back to Iraq, Saddam Hussein may not be there or may not be able to do anything to them.
Out of 18 million Iraqis, 1 million of them are exiles. And many more would be if they could come out. This is not a democracy we're talking about. It's a police state. And right now the police are on top. But the minute the regime falls, it'll be a slightly different ballgame.
And maybe a different Iraq.
One hopes.
James Dunnigan, thank you very much. Back now to Tom Brokaw in Saudi Arabia. Tom.
Thank you, Gary Catlett. Just reflecting on some of what Jim Dunnigan had to say, the many hypocrisies of Saddam Hussein when he invoked the jihad and portrayed himself as a great religious leader. Of course, he's been passionate about the Ba'ath Socialist Party, which was decidedly a secular party. It was designed in part to undo the influence of the Islamic movement in not just in Iraq, but in Syria as well. One of the airborne colonels that we talked to before the war began, commenting on the experience that the Iraqis may have picked up in fighting the Iranians, said in a quiet aside, and this is not a man given to a lot of boldness, listen, when they come and fight us, they're not fighting a bunch of Iranian teenagers in the back of a pickup truck. But we can only hope that that's the case as the war now is going on. In New York at this moment is Gary Sick, who is an authority on this part of the world, who wrote extensively, of course, on the American involvement with the Iranians during the Iran crisis in the Carter administration. Gary, let me ask you now about what happens with Iran once this war is over. We have all declared it the win-win situation for Iran. It gets rid of a big enemy in Iraq. It has restored itself as a more responsible party in the Middle East. But I dare say that it was going to be causing a lot of concern to places like Saudi Arabia and the smaller Gulf Emirates right along the Persian Gulf.
The Iranians have been positioning themselves right from the start of this crisis to play the major role in the Gulf, and they very much want to be the dominant power in the Gulf. They're not setting themselves up to conquer their neighbors, but they're already laying the groundwork so that they can, in effect, be a player with the Gulf Cooperation Council and others. The other thing that they've done that shows that fairly clever footwork is that they're now purchasing military equipment from the Soviet Union, and at the same time, Rafsanjani is talking about talking to the United States, and he's opening up that possibility. The big problem that Iran has is internal. The regime is not a success economically. It is still ridden with factions, and they have a real problem with control there.
Let's talk now about another area in which you are an authority, and that is terrorism. Not terrorism from Iran this time, but terrorism from Iraq. Would you expect that as Saddam Hussein is pinned down, shoved deeper into the corner from which there is no escape, that he has the capacity to unleash some kind of terrorist attacks around the world?
You know, he has tried to do that since the beginning of the war. He had George Habash and all of the standard terrorist groups there in Baghdad at the beginning of the war. They all held council, and they began sending out messages, and clearly there's been an attempt to launch terrorist attacks. There have been 8 or 9 bombings in Beirut, which is the standard place for terrorists to operate. There have been 2 or 3 in Saudi Arabia, some in Turkey, but you know, there really hasn't been an extreme explosion of terrorism of the sort that he would have liked. It's the same kind of question we have to ask ourselves about his weapons of mass destruction. Does he have something up his sleeve? Does he have something in the last second that he can pull out that he's been reserving for this moment? We don't know the answer to that question, but my guess is that he has been pushed so hard over the past several weeks that if he really had the terrorist card to play, he would have been playing it. That's not to say terrorism is going to stop or that it's not going to go on, but in terms of something really massive that would throw us off track or change the course of events, it's very hard to see how he's going to do that.
Gary, I dare say that on 2 counts, 2 very important counts, Saddam Hussein has defied all forecasts. One, he has not had the military capacity that everyone thought that he had. And 2, he has turned out to be the kind of man who was willing to go to the bargaining table when ultimately everyone thought that he would find a way to negotiate his way out of this. Let me ask you another question about the reaction of the Palestinians, especially those radical Palestinian factions that are more militant, what they will think when they learn that he really didn't care about them as early as last fall. Jenny Primikoff is saying in Time magazine this week that when he saw, as a representative of President Gorbachev, when he saw Saddam Hussein in Baghdad in October, Saddam Hussein made it clear that it wasn't important to him to link the Palestinian question to the resolution of this war. Do you think that Yasser Arafat and George Habash and others will then step back even farther from Saddam Hussein?
You know, this was always a very strange marriage between the two. Saddam had let it be known, certainly after the Iran-Iraq war was over, that the Palestinians were an issue apart, that he wasn't that concerned about them, and in fact was apparently trying to cut a deal with Israel. And everybody knew about that. I think as he got into trouble, however, he began to be backed into a corner. The Palestinians were also being backed into a corner, and they really had nothing but themselves. It's like two drunks leaning against each other for support. And now that one of those supports is about to fall down, I think the Palestinians will quietly go off and look for another place. Outcomes count. And in this case, when they see Saddam Hussein thrown out or his forces destroyed, when they see that he is not going to be of any help anymore, they're going to go someplace else. They are survivors above and beyond anything else, and they're going to have to look for other places to go. Saddam Hussein is not...
The British troops are known to be with the main U.S. and Allied attack force, the one that's going to try to run that rapid flanking movement. Where it goes and exactly what directions it will take is what the Iraqis have to guess. There's one school of thought, one option open to General Schwarzkopf is to drive all the way to the Euphrates River inside southern Iraq, and in that way cut off all effort to resupply even the Republican Guard, which is down in that corner of Iraq that borders on Kuwait. All of that unfolding out in the desert in a news blackout by the Americans, the British, the French, and the Arabs are obviously not observing that news blackout, as Defense Secretary Cheney said that the U.S. is putting on a news blackout to protect forces so far as they could be protected, and we're respecting that and doing what we can not to pinpoint the exact location of any forces. Our CBS News coverage of the war in the Gulf, now including a ground war, will continue in a moment. The Pentagon has clamped a lid on just about all information from the front to protect American lives, it said. The British and the French are not observing it. Arab military sources report that U.S. troops are at least 18 miles inside Kuwait at one point. Those are Marine forces. That was within 2 hours of the launch of the ground war. That's in the direction of Kuwait City. It was just 3 hours ago that President Bush told the American people the last phase of Operation Desert Storm has begun.
Final phase.
Huge 16-inch guns of the battleships Missouri and Wisconsin, and these are his words from the front, making the ground beneath us rumble. Let's go to Mark Phillips at the White House. Mark, what's the latest there?
Well, Dan, in fact, the news clampdown on this war extends even as far as here. The White House is effectively, at least the press office part of it, is effectively closed for the evening. The next place we expect to see President Bush is as he attends church tomorrow morning, presumably to do what he counseled all Americans to do, which is to pray for the troops now in action on the ground in the Gulf. What has emerged here over the course of the evening is just how much this plan was, in fact, a pre-plan. In fact, there wasn't so much an order that went out of here today to initiate this action. It would have taken an order to stop the action. General Schwarzkopf in the Gulf had a plan ready to go. This was the evening which he had told the president that he wanted most to initiate this action. The plan was to have this action, in fact, go ahead as scheduled unless there was an order from here for that not to happen. There was a good deal of diplomatic toing and froing today. The president was on the phone to various members of the coalition. There was a call here today as well from the president of the Soviet Union, Mr. Gorbachev, asking the president, in fact, to do what he could to try to delay this action for another day or two. The word that went back was a very diplomatically couched response, which was effectively that the coalition had decided on its course of action and was going to execute that course of action, and that's just what we're seeing now. Dan?
David Martin's at the Pentagon. David?
Dan, we're focusing on the ground war tonight for obvious reasons, but I think it's important to point out to people that the air war is continuing. These literally 2,500 or more combat missions that are flown every day, those are going on as well. And in fact, in the few public comments that Defense Secretary Cheney and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Colin Powell, have made about the battle plan, they talk about the ground offensive as simply a means of making the air war more effective by forcing the Iraqi army to come out of its fortifications and expose itself to airstrikes. So this is very much what the military calls a combined arms operation. And you can imagine, or perhaps we really can't imagine, what it would be like for an Iraqi soldier right now. Whatever is left of his communications is undoubtedly being jammed by American electronics. So he doesn't know what's happening except this rain of fire is coming in on him. And he's got two choices. Sit there in his fortification and be overrun, or come out, try to move, and expose himself to even more deadly fire. It's a very cruel situation for the Iraqi army.
One reason that U.S. forces, and General Schwarzkopf made this clear from the beginning, will be moving with main forces. That's the central part of the battle now, but also be using deep forces put in deep into Iraq. Where is for Saddam Hussein to guess. But that's part of what the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne are about. When General Schwarzkopf decides to do it and where he decides to do it, to be part of the deep attack, which will be out front of the main force attack. Let's talk about how Iraq may fight the war. Bob Schieffer has prepared this report.
To give us a better understanding of this desert warfare and just what it entails, joining us our military consultant, retired Marine General George Crist. General Crist, first give us a brief overview of the battle area.
Bob, these red lines that you see on the map represent 170 miles of Iraqi fortifications and trenches, some 30 miles deep. Now, each one of these red lines looks very, very much like the model that we have here in front of us.
So let's talk about that. This sand piled up, what we've come to know as the berms, these are the Iraqi tanks behind it. Then what's in front?
Well, right here, of course, are the final protection. In fact, they live in bunkers inside these sand berms. In front, protecting them are extensive minefields with wire. Beyond that, an anti-tank ditch to keep the tanks from getting down to them. And beyond that, another large sand pile, or berm as we call it, which is designed, again, to keep the infantry and the tanks from being able to come straight in.
Now, to give us an even better picture of this, we have some rare film taken during the Iran-Iraq War.
Bob, these are pictures shot during the Iran-Iraq War, and we're looking at an Iraqi tank from the Iranian side. That tank is out in the open, much the same as we're going to see their tanks out. Now, he's coming under fire. You see the artillery fire. Here goes an RPG shooting at him, and he's going to try to hide. And he's going behind one of those sand berms that we're talking about that they, too, will use to protect their tank from our fire. And now he's completely hidden, as you can see. We can't get a shot at him.
Now, General, you talked about sometimes the Iraqi soldiers actually live in these berms. We have some photos of that now. Let's look at that.
Hey, Bob, here you are. Very clearly in the background, you can see the big sand berm. And built into them are these bunkers. You notice they're sandbagged, built right in the side. This is an observation post that they built on top of, right on top of the berm. It's been, of course, hit and blown away. Here you get another good picture of how they build in sandbags on the front so that the artillery fire won't get them when they're in there. Here's one that unfortunately took a direct hit. The occupant seems to have not survived the direct hit. That's unfortunate if you're inside the bunker. Here's a little bit better one, and that shows a really good picture. See, again, the sandbags build up, corrugated tin on the top, sand at the top of it, so there's no way that you can get hit in that thing unless you get a direct hit.
General, you lived through some artillery attacks, I understand, in Korea and bunkers just like that. What was that like?
Well, my bunker was stronger than the one you saw, Bob, and I was scared as hell.
This whole idea of trench warfare is not a very pleasant way to spend the day. We have some more tape of the Iran-Iraq War.
Here you see on top of one of those berms an anti-tank rifle firing, and right down below it is the trench, and you can see these men are in their gas masks and protective equipment, much the same, I think, as the Iraqi troops would be if they use it on us.
Now you see the inside of the trench itself. It's dirty, it's filthy. The men, you can see, they're dirty, probably have lights, junk sitting on the bottom of the trenches, as it always is, everything you throw away. Not a pleasant way to spend your day. Now here's the incoming sort of artillery in on those trenches, what you hear, and here's the forward observers now that are calling the fire back out against them. Again, your average diamond trench. Now here's a trench after battle, and it does look like it. The rifle, the gas mask, the dead body, the kind of thing you always see after a good solid engagement in a trench. Marine General George Criss, our consultant. Thank you, General. Let's check in now with David Dow, who is outside Camp Pendleton, California, and he has a report on the mood of one community.
Any Saturday night. Home of the Camp Pendleton Marines. But inside, all eyes were on the televised war coverage. News of the long-awaited ground campaign brought a change.
If the results mean anything, it will be the Allies by a landslide. 1, dramatic victories in every battle in which we have reports. 2, the Iraqis simply have no air cover. But the stiffest test is yet to come. Out there in the desert somewhere, General Schwarzkopf thinks he knows exactly where is the Republican Guard, Saddam Hussein's last hope, his only hope for a victory of any significance. Joining us now is Dr. Hussan al-Sanad, who is Kuwait's Deputy of Information. Thank you for being with us. We appreciate you being here. What can you tell us about what's happening and what we can look for in the coming hours and days?
Well, to us, the events unfolding in the past few hours are very important events. We've been waiting for it for 6 months, and as we see it, following it, minute by minute, hour by hour, we are seeing the end of the occupation of our land, the beginning of the liberation of Kuwait, freeing it from the tyrant in Baghdad. And what we are hearing is good news, such as the liberation of Failaka Island, which is the populated island, one of the populated islands in Kuwait. And we are looking forward to the unfolding events in the few today and tomorrow.
What are you hearing about the oil well fires that have been set by Saddam Hussein's forces?
We've been hearing a lot. We've been hearing that he is systematically setting them on fire. Actually, we had information much earlier, about 2 or 3 months ago, that he mined all the oil fields in Kuwait, waiting for this desperate minute and last move. So here it is. He started setting them on fire. But unfortunately, they kept lying to the world that it is the doing of the Allied forces.
But we just heard a gentleman, a respected scholar in Jordan, say, actually he suggested, he didn't outright say, that a lot of this is just propaganda, this talk of Saddam setting oil wells afire and arresting people and executing people. Address yourself to that, please.
Well, I understand exactly what he's saying because I've been in Jordan last month, and I am a Kuwaiti. I have been in Kuwait when the Iraqi troops invaded. I'm proud to be an Arab. I'm proud to be a Muslim. I'm proud to be a Kuwaiti. My response to this colleague in Jordan, that he is ignorant, he's deceiving himself, just like the Iraqi leader and the Iraqi Ba'ath regime is deceiving their people. We're seeing them being bounded, their planes being destroyed, and they are claiming hundreds of planes of the Allies are being shut down. This is the whole world is seeing it. Unfortunately, they don't want to be, to see facts and of life. What is happening? What is happening exactly is an aggression upon peaceful country, a reign of terror that's been going on for 6 months, being escalated the last 2 weeks. People were rounded up from the streets. Just last night, we heard the news from Kuwait that they were taking people, anyone in the street, any Kuwaiti in the street, they are picking them up. Just 2 days ago, they rounded people after a Friday prayer. They are coming out of the ceremony, they rounded them up in buses and trucks. So my response to him, that I did get in my hand, I have a proof of it also, report from Jordan itself. Some Palestinian friends of mine, whom I have taught in Kuwait University, they worked in the oil industry in Kuwait. They gave me reports about detailed reports about the mining of the oil in the fields. We have it, and I have sent it to my government when I came back from Jordan.
So it isn't propaganda, it's fact.
I know it is for sure, it's fact, and I have been these people when they came over to my country, rampaging.
Thank you very much for being with us. We hope you'll be back in your country and home again soon.
Thank you very much
for being with us. As the ground war offensive rumbles, here are headlines of the hour. President Bush declares the war to liberate Kuwait has, quote, entered a final phase. U.S. and allied ground forces are reported advancing into occupied Kuwait and maneuvering in southern Iraq. Baghdad remains officially silent. A single Scud missile has been fired at Saudi Arabia. Allied ground forces are said to be moving rapidly northward on at least 4 fronts. Now, this comes from Arab sources and from British sources. Some units plunging up to 18 miles into Kuwait, other units going into southern Iraq. All of this within the first 2 hours of the offensive that was launched about 5 hours ago. These reports come from Saudi and British sources. The Pentagon, under its new rules, refuses to comment. As the attack began, the Kuwaiti news agency reported that the small island that was referred to earlier near Kuwait City was captured with the surrender of some 500 to 1,000 Iraqi soldiers. The UN Security Council met briefly late last night, but the meeting broke up after 20 minutes, delegates saying ceasefire efforts were being abandoned. Now, numbers can tell a story. They can mean something. We're talking about, we mentioned there, the report that as the Marines invaded with an amphibious assault that island that controls the access to Kuwait City, that they took 500 to 1,000 prisoners. The number of prisoners taken early in this ground war will give us a good indication of how tough or how easy the task of liberating Kuwait is going to be. The early indications are that a lot of prisoners are being taken. Joining us now is Lieutenant Colonel Ra'nan Grissom, the Israeli Army spokesman. Colonel, first of all, I hope that I pronounced your name correctly. Thank you for being with us. What do you know about what's going on inside the offensive?
Well, we know as much as you do, or perhaps even a little less. Of course, we keep abreast of the developments. All I can say right now is that we congratulate Allied forces for taking this move at this stage, and we hope that they prosecute this phase of the war as successfully as they have done the first phase of the air operation.
Colonel, you have so much combat experience. What should we look for in the coming hours and days? What will be the telltale signs of how the battle is going?
Well, I would say that I would be very cautious in trying to draw conclusions from past battle, past combat to what is happening right now in the Gulf. This is a different war, different technology, superior air power, which is in full control, devastating artillery power of Allied forces. So it would be very premature to give now an assessment. What I do believe is that U.S. and Allied forces will be able to use all those advantages in order to shorten the war, to minimize casualties, and avoid the direct contact which was so evident in past wars in the Korea and World War II. And I'm sure all these elements were taken into consideration when this ground offensive was planned.
What about your own forces? What are they doing as this Allied ground attack grinds into Kuwait and southern Iraq?
Well, what I can say about Israel in general, that we woke up to another morning of what we call an emergency routine. And after consultation, which was taking place in the Defense Ministry throughout the night, we decided still to resume normal life in Israel today. And all the schools were open, people went back to work. Of course, our forces are in a high state of alert and readiness to meet any new developing contingencies. But as of now, we don't see any increase in the threat dimensions that we faced for the past 38 days of this campaign. So we will, as you say, roll with the punches and continue with our emergency routine. And of course, if there are new developments and new threats emerging, we'll be prepared to meet them.
Colonel, thanks for being with us. Good luck. Our CBS News coverage of the ground offensive here in and around the Persian Gulf continues.
But around the smoke, I saw plenty of oil fields burning. I think they burned almost 25% of Kuwait, mostly on the south now, and I think they destroy all the oil installations.
The smoke could be a handicap to the American Marine Corps Task Force and its Harrier strike planes. They're expected to make an amphibious assault on the coast of Kuwait. It's conceivable that Saddam's forces could set fire to another 900 oil wells in the next few hours and days. That represents the remaining 3/4 of undamaged wells in the occupied territory. Brian Barron, BBC News, Eastern Saudi Arabia.
U.S. officials also allege Iraqi forces have been waging an escalated campaign of terror against citizens in occupied Kuwait. Pentagon officials say there are unconfirmed reports that executions of Kuwaiti citizens have increased in recent days, and tens of thousands of Kuwaitis have reportedly been rounded up, detained, and tortured.
The United States and its allies have already dropped more tons of bombs on Iraq and Kuwait than the Allies dropped on Europe in all of World War II. But now the military strategy gets much more complex. Wolf Blitzer has a report on how the battle may be taking shape.
The confrontation would begin at night. The scenario, the Iraqi front line has been taking artillery hits for days. Further back, the crack Republican Guard has been pounded and demoralized by constant bombing. Now comes the big push. The goal, bluntly stated by the nation's top soldier.
Our strategy to go after this army is very, very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it.
The players. Allied combat units stretching from the Persian Gulf into the desert west of Kuwait. Nearly 20,000 U.S. Marines on amphibious landing ships, ready to storm the beaches. F-16s and A-10s, standing by to attack Iraqi armor. And in the west, 3 large U.S. Army Corps with hundreds of M1A1 battle tanks, plus a British armored division. It may be the largest tank force ever assembled for one battle. The Allies have another key weapon, deception. In the scenario, the Allied tank force sweeps north under cover of darkness 2 days before the actual ground war begins.
At dawn, they'll settle down, they'll cover up, they'll try to hide themselves, so that the Iraqis may not know until it's too late, even, that they're in their own territory. And the next night, they'll move again, hoping to catch up to the attacking Iraqis.
Allied forces move against the Iraqi front line probably in 2 places. The strategy, force the Iraqis to flee their fortifications and launch a counterattack.
These 2 forces would penetrate deep into Kuwait, causing the Iraqi commander to move his mobile reserve.
First to cross into Kuwait, Saudis, Kuwaitis, and troops of other Gulf nations massed along the coast. Combat engineers clear the way by breaching Iraqi fortifications and minefields.
They would be exposed, but again, when we in the Army commit our engineers, we wouldn't commit them without them being protected by overwatching fire and suppressive fire.
To suppress enemy fire, the Allies use heavy machine guns and anti-tank weapons, ground-to-ground rockets, and artillery. Advancing troops will fire heavy artillery into Iraqi positions just ahead of them.
In my own case in Vietnam, I brought artillery to within 50 meters of my tanks and personnel carriers, which wasn't very hard to do, and we're even better at it now than we were before.
The Allies' attack jets, loaded with Maverick missiles, coordinate with the ground forces.
What worries me mostly is the artillery that the Iraqis possess, that it's going to be difficult for us to reach out and touch them unless we have a lot of air support.
The warplanes target Iraqi tanks, armor, and artillery, the last element important because it could outdistance U.S. guns and deliver chemical shells. Helicopter gunships and Harrier jump jets provide close support. The hope? A combined air, land, and sea assault will pry Iraqi tanks from their dug-in positions, force them into the open, and make them easier targets. The coalition...
Particularly those units that are faced with overwhelming firepower. Other Iraqi forces have fought well under what appears to be good leaders. Some would say that the Battle of Khafji was an example of that. It's a mixed bag on the Iraqi side. We do know this, that under what's called this air-land battle concept, the U.S. and some of its allied forces depend mightily on excellent leadership all up and down the line and local initiative leadership. Now, that's supposed to make the big difference, particularly in an open desert armor, fire, and movement campaign. Combat over the next few days will provide the life and death test. Eric Ingberg's looking at some of the weapons the Allies are relying on to help them with their leadership. Eric?
Dan, one of the reasons that Iraq's army, even after the pummeling they've taken from the Air Force, is still dangerous is because they have plenty of tanks and they have plenty of artillery pieces.
The U.S. High Command said before the ground offensive got underway that it believes it has destroyed about 40% of the Iraqi army's tanks, but that still leaves them with about 2,000, enough to pose a real threat to the troops involved in the offensive. Now, to neutralize the kind of armor that Iraq has with minimum casualties to ground troops, the Americans are relying on their control of the skies. And a big part of that is a strange-looking airplane called the A-10. It is so ugly that the pilots call it the Warthog. Already the Warthog has made itself something of a hero to American ground troops. I've seen them salute it as it goes over. They like it so much. It is built for knocking out tanks. It carries almost 8 tons of bombs and other kinds of ordnance, including missiles that it can drop on ground targets. It is built to sustain or to withstand withering ground fire. The pilot actually rides inside a titanium cockpit so that if he is hit by machine gun fire, he can survive. The gun on the Warthog is a Gatling-type gun that fires 30-millimeter rounds. And this airplane, an old-fashioned type airplane, that is to say it doesn't have much in the way of electronics and computers and things like that, is built to be flown. One pilot says it's ugly and mean. It's a pilot's kind of airplane. And when American armored and mechanized infantry are exposed, have their flanks exposed, the way they're going to have in this kind of a headlong dash against Iraqi targets, the kind of control of the skies that the Warthog can provide will be critical, Dan. There are a lot of Iraqi tanks left in there, particularly with experienced tankers in the Republican Guard. The weapons to get them, the M1 tank weapon, which has longer range, the TOW guided missiles on the ground, the Apache and other helicopters that can attack from very close in, and aircraft such as the Warthog. Control of the sky is absolutely essential to the Americans' ability to get through this without a lot of casualties. Thanks, Eric. There are, as we know, many Americans of Arab heritage.
Its armies to destroy, to fight. They always tell us, the United States, that we have to arrive at a negotiated settlement with Israel. And yet, they refuse to negotiate with Iraq. And that's how we feel. We feel very, very sorry indeed.
Professor, you know it's the American way to hear opposing points of view, to hear all points of view. Respectfully, may I ask, do you believe that Saddam Hussein invaded, occupied Kuwait to help the Palestinian cause?
Well, I think you see that there is a misconception about Saddam and Iraq and what he did to Kuwait. By the way, as Palestinians, we are against the occupation of Kuwait or any land that does not belong to those occupiers, because we are occupied ourselves. However, I think that you must remember that Saddam Hussein is not the cause of what is happening today in the Middle East. He is a symptom, as Nasser was, Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt was at one time. You see, in 1956, France and Britain attacked Nasser. They attacked him, and it was called then collusion. The United States was not a part of that, and we were very grateful for that. However, 20 years hence or so, we find that the United States is coming in with France and Britain again, under the name of coalition, to fight another leader. Now, I don't think that you are really getting at the cause of what is happening in the Middle East. I think you are chasing shadows. Saddam is a man who will one day die, whether of natural causes or otherwise. There will be other Saddams. The issue at hand is the Palestinian problem. Unless you help to solve this problem, you will never get a stable Middle East, and we will never get peace. We are very, very sorry indeed to hear that the United States is here to fight, because for a long time, the negative predispositions of the Arabs towards the West would be reinforced and would be intensified.
Tonight, I talked with CBS News reporter Bob McEwen, who was right near the front line. I'm going to replay the tape of that conversation for you.
Executing Kuwaiti citizens. How extensive those executions are is not yet clear. U.S. commanders say the land battle they expect will be won in short order, but they caution that the Iraqis, however damaged, remain a formidable foe. So far, there is little word on progress or casualties on the front line. In eastern Saudi Arabia, this is Paul Meinke reporting.
After giving the green light to Allied Forces Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf, President Bush went on national TV to explain why he ordered the ground war. As Vic Ratner reports, it was a grim, rather stern message, followed by an equally subdued explanation by the
Ground
Secretary
troops
of...
are already reported to be well into Kuwait. Tonight, pushing toward Kuwait City. It was in this area, incidentally, where Marines have been trading artillery fire for several days and where they reportedly took some 300 prisoners. French troops are also part of that right now. Coalition forces are also said to be working their way into this portion of Iraq. This is where the vaunted Republican Guard is stationed right now. Part of this column is going to engage the Republican Guard, and with the Guard so occupied, they certainly are not going to be a response force to these Iraqi forces down here in the southern part of the country as their defenses break down. That's exactly what the Republican Guard is designed to be, and these troops, incidentally, were the first to leave this morning. They now have about 13 hours of combat experience. Also, out here in the Gulf, this small island, considered to be the gateway to Kuwait, was reportedly overtaken by coalition forces today. 500 prisoners of war taken there. There's that island right there. Also, some of the Marines landing there said they were surprised to find as many bodies as they did of Iraqi soldiers. And as this new phase of the war is mounted, of course, the one advantage that the coalition forces have that Iraqis do not have is the air war that's going on all over this theater, all over Kuwait as well, and it certainly does give the coalition forces the upper hand right now. Again, to reiterate, this is not classified material.
For sure, this is ideal tank country, and no country has ever been conquered from the air. It's almost as though we practiced for 45 years to fight this war in Central Europe. This is NATO tactics from ground one, and what they'll do with their heavy weapons is try to break through the outer defensive crust and find some objective that Saddam Hussein thinks is so valuable that he must fight for, come out of his hole, come out of his defensive positions, and then fight a battle maneuver. And when he does, the pilots that have been complaining about few targets are going to find targets like they've never seen.
So the ground war will flush out a lot of people for the air and the ground troops.
Well, yes, indeed. Now, of course, the big X factor is Iraqi morale. If they fight like Vietnamese, it's going to be hard sledding. If they fight like, say, Egyptians in 1967, this war could be over in 10 days.
Eric, a lot of viewers, are watching, obviously, trying to get some idea of how the war is going. What kind of things should they be looking for?
Prisoners. Absolutely. Matter of fact, I wouldn't even, I'd throw in my maps. When Dick Cheney said that he was having a news blackout, my guess is that he and Powell really don't know a heck of a lot more than we do. A ground battle is chaos, absolute, total, utter chaos. And what you really want to hear is large units giving up, raising the white flag. If they start to do that, means the Army's falling apart. And units defend each other. So if one unit surrenders, the guy next to him is also in trouble, and it has a ripple effect. You get a panic setting in, and like I said, and a whole army could just fall apart.
So count on prisoners of war, interesting.
That's what I'd be interested in.
Thank you, Eric.
All of his best armored and mechanized divisions, effectively what he had left, would all be third-rate forces.
Tony, thank you. We're running late, so thanks very much for being with us. Coming next, Sheikh Saud Nasir Al Sabah, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, and shortly, our Secretary of State, James A. Baker. In a moment. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for coming. Pleased to have you with us. Sure. Now, you have heard, as we have heard, the talk today from the Middle East, from the Gulf, that your country, or at least Kuwait City, may be liberated even today. Is that unduly optimistic in your judgment?
Well, we don't really have any confirmation on these reports coming out, but let me say before we get into a discussion on this topic that we should give credit where credit is due, and that is that man in the White House, President George Bush, and to this administration, and to the people of this great nation